Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Lovett, before we had our first break, you were talking about African Americans in the colonial North America. And of course, let's continue that, and let's have you to give us some information in terms of the independence movement, and then move on into talking about the Constitution.
Well, African Americans were very important in the independence movement of the country. And the independence movement had a lot of impact upon the institution of slavery. By 1776, for example, the Quakers in Philadelphia are the first to declare that they're anti-slavery, and they formed the first anti-slavery society. What the revolutionary movement did was it made Americans think about the relationship of man to man, and about freedom, equality, and the fraternity of man, and liberty of man. And they could not ignore that almost a quarter of the country were enslaved, regardless of their color or their race. And so much of the anti-slavery movement started during the American Revolutionary Movement. 1780, Massachusetts, once it changes its constitution as a result of declaring independence from Britain, the first thing that it does was to outlaw slavery. And most of the northern states will do so by 1820 through gradual abolition acts. Acts that say, well, when the slave becomes 18, she must be freed. When the slave is 21, he must be freed. And gradually the North will get rid of slavery from that impetus from the American Revolution. The South will retain it, and so you can basically say the American Revolution was the beginning of the American Civil War, because ultimately we will have a nation that's half slave and half free. Most of the states will have gotten rid of slavery, and the South, of course, will have maintained that slavery. And the South will be able to do so because it will dominate the political life of the country right for the next 2 generations. There will be a Southern dynasty of presidents, slave owners, Washington and Jefferson, and then there will be Madison and Monroe, and then there will be Andrew Jackson and Tyler of Virginia, and Polk of Tennessee, and and so Southerners were pretty much dominated.
Just a whole range of presidents.
They were pretty much dominated because the South was the wealthiest region during colonial and New Nation period. They had the exports. They sold the cotton and the tobacco and the lumber abroad, and that brought cash and imports back into the country. So it was not the North that was the wealthy region, it was the South. And the South was the most populated region of the country at that time. But by 1860, it will be different. And immigrants will not come into the South, European immigrants, because they couldn't compete with free slave labor. So 75% of immigrants will come into the North. The North will grow by leaps and bounds. It will outdistance the South in industry and technology. By 1860, the North will own 90% of all the industry and the technology in the country, and the South will be generally, comparatively, a pretty backward region, culturally, technologically, industrial. And so you would have 2 sides that are that wide apart by 1860.
That really were, in reality, almost 2 different nations.
Right, and in the middle of all of that, the real controversy is slavery. One side is still depending upon slavery. One side is still pretty an agrarian nation. It's pretty, more than half its people can't read and write. 90% of the slaves can't read and write. It was a pretty backward region for that day and time in the world. And it was inevitable that they would clash, and it was inevitable that the weaker side would lose, and that weaker side was the South. But the conflict really starts with the putting together of the Constitution in 1787. When they met at Philadelphia for those 2 or 3 months, starting from May down to about August of 1787, and decided to put together a Constitution that would bring those 13 colonies into a nation, the real issue was slavery. And the North didn't want it anymore. The South, still wanted to retain it and depended upon it and had to retain it. At least they thought they had to retain it. And so if you look at the Constitution, it has many references to slavery. For example, number 1, it has a clause in the Constitution that any slaves brought into the country, the federal government would get a $10 head tax, which is really the first revenues that the new government has is from slavery.
Come off slave.
But they also put a clause in there that by the year 1808, the slave trade will be shut down. So they compromised with the South that from 1787 until 1807, 20-year period of time, a generation in that day and time, we'll let you continue bringing in slaves, but after 1807, we shut the door. And while they are coming in, you're going to have to pay $10 for each slave you bring into this country. So it was to discourage any more slaves from coming into the country. The other compromise is the 3/5 compromise. The South had more people than the North. And so they put in the Constitution, wait a minute, we're not going to let you count all of the slaves. We'll let you count some of them, because they can't vote, they don't run for political office, so it's not fair. They're not really citizens. And therefore, we'll only let you count 3/5 of them. And that was to hurt Virginia, because Virginia had half of her population almost were slaves. So the 3/5 compromise only let the South count 3/5 of the slaves instead of counting all of the slaves. And at the same time, the South sort of won out because the states were taxed according to the number of people they had. And so it diminished the tax burden on the South a little bit. When the Civil War is over, comparatively, if I can skip ahead, by 1865, and slaves are free, and there are no more slaves, the South now counts all of its black people. And in 1 year alone, the South recovers 35 seats in the House of Representatives.
Simply by counting all of the...
By now counting, and now they become politically powerful, and they were just defeated on the battlefield. And that's one of the reasons that the North rushed to enfranchise those African Americans who will vote Republican right up until 1957. Blacks will be predominantly Republican, and the Republicans will enfranchise them in order, of course, to balance that political power that the South had gotten in 1865, 66 as a result of
And all of this was laid in this minute before our commercial break, and I don't want to get into another question right here, but all of this is laid out in the Constitution.
It is laid out in the Constitution, and that is why in the 1857 case of Dred Scott, it was a blow to the North, and it was a gain for the South when the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, who was a slave, could not sue because he was not a citizen, and that he had no rights and he was only property. And but that gave a lot of weight to the South. But at the same time, the North argued, wait a minute, there were many free blacks in that day and time when the Constitution was ratified in 1789, 88, and they were right. And free blacks did vote, and they did vote for the ratification of the Constitution. So not all blacks were not considered citizens in 1787. Nevertheless, the court ruled in favor of the South in 1857.
Good. Dr. Lovett, let me interrupt for this final commercial break, and we'll be back with you following this commercial break. Dean of Art